That's the message to Rockford residents who want to end residential segregation and lay the groundwork for change in our city. This is all part of a housing justice symposium Wednesday evening.
23 News reporter Anthony Ferretti talks with one Rockford resident about their plans to help tackle racial housing justice.
City leaders and housing experts believe the key to addressing the centuries-long wrongdoing is to act in one of four ways: as an individual, part of a coalition, an organization, or an advocate.
The previous generation created this environment.
Organizers of Wednesday's Housing Justice Symposium say Rockford is one of thousands of cities nationwide impacted by residential segregation. And those attending the event at Rock Valley College are hopeful that by addressing these disparities, it can lead to a more integrated Rockford.
A lot of good information in regards to how the federal government, how we as voters supported that, whether we knew it or not.
Regina Cook-Glanton is a member of 815 Eliminate Racism. She believes her group can be part of the solution.
Teaching them how to do finance so they can save up and purchase their own homes, help develop resources so that people will have the money to put it down to purchase.
Keynote speakers and New York Times bestselling authors Richard and Leah Rothstein say they've seen a big part of racial segregation via the number of black homeowners who are overpaying on their property taxes. One solution they offer is to include banking with institutions investing in communities of color and diverse neighborhoods.
Understanding the history is the first step. It's not the last step. The next step has to actually be doing something about it.
The only way to change that is to change how the county tax assessment system works. And we can advocate for that change together locally.
In reality, we're all alike. We want the same things.
Leah says Prairie State Legal in Rockford offers fair testing, which involves individuals posing as people who are seeking out a home. They have similar qualifications but different races, so they can find out if racial discrimination is happening.
Thank you, Anthony. The Rothsteins co-authored a book called Just Action, which looks at local strategies you can implement for housing justice.